Okay, welcome to today's herpetology seminar. Thank you to everyone for coming along today. So we'll get going then. So today you're in for a treat. So we've got Rich Baxter, who is the project director for the Indian Ocean Tortoise Alliance. And Rich is going to speak to you today about On Giants, an overview of research and rewilding with Aldabra giant tortoises. So thanks, everyone, and over to you, Rich. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Simon. Hi, everyone, and thanks for having me along to this seminar series. It's good to be here, and I hope to give you a bit of an insight into some of the work I've been involved with over the past few years with the Aldabra giant tortoises from the research side, and then try and convince you that rewilding projects with giant tortoises, especially the Aldabrans, are good for the future. So without further ado, on the backdrop of extinctions, there were giant tortoises all over the world, going back all the way to the Miolanids in Australasia. And unfortunately, they've all gone extinct, mostly due to direct human impact, but also some climate-related extinctions as well. And if we focus in on the Indian Ocean in particular, this area here, there was also, even not so long ago as 1,200 years, there was the Aldabra Kellis, which is the Aldabra group in the Seychelles. There were giant tortoises on Madagascar as well. And then in the Mascarenes, you had the Cylindropsis clade, which is the Mauritius and Reunion Islands. And unfortunately, they went the same way. They had the same fate of bumping into people, and people put them on their boats, and they were very quickly extinct. So by the 1870s, the only giant tortoise species left in the Indian Ocean was the Aldabra Kellis gigantea, the Aldabra giant tortoise. There are some other large tortoises that still exist in the region, which is the Astrachelis species, such as the plowshare tortoise, which is an incredibly rare tortoise species in Madagascar, down to about 400, they think, in the wild, but the numbers aren't clear. And then obviously the Madagascan radiated tortoise as well. So these are quite large tortoises and have a lot of conservation work going on them from lots of different organizations. But what we're trying to look at today is the Aldabra giant tortoise. And due to these extinctions that happened in the Mascarenes and the Seychelles Islands as well, there's been a lot of conservation activity surrounding them. One of the first reported cases of translocating a species for conservation was actually the Aldabra giant tortoise, when Richard Owen and Charles Darwin signed a letter to the governor of Mauritius saying, please, can you take these giant tortoises from Aldabra because they're going to be extinct if we don't. And sure enough, they were shipped from Aldabra to Mauritius. And some of those tortoises that are still in Mauritius hold some keys to what the genetic life was like for these Aldabran giant tortoises, which we'll go into later. But how is it that these Aldabra giant tortoises survived? Well, luckily, their survival is due to the remoteness of this atoll. This is the Aldabra atoll. This is the wild range of the Aldabra giant tortoise. It's 35 kilometers long. It's about 15 kilometers wide with 155 square kilometers. So it's quite large, but by no means is it easy to get around. The 4 islands that make up the atoll surround a large lagoon. And there are tortoises on three of the islands, apart from Pelimni, which has no tortoises on it. The population at the moment stands around 100,000, but it went down to, they think, less than 1,000 to around 600 tortoises in the 1850s, 1870s, somewhere around there. So they've gone through a big bottleneck as the population has regrown. Now, Aldabra itself is incredibly flat. The highest point above sea level is 18 meters. So you can get the sense that it's a very inhospitable place, very dry, with lots of coastal bush, and not very high. therefore susceptible to sea level rise that is expected as a cause of climate change. The density of tortoises, I wonder if I can use my pen. The density of tortoises you'll see here is the highest on the atoll. Here you've got about 80,000 tortoises all living together. Malabar's got a little less of around 10,000, we think. And then dunes, they're sort of spread all the way across this side of the atoll. With Picard, that didn't have any tortoises, but it has now around 5,000 tortoises. So this has been a really interesting island to work on because we've been able to study the population as it's rebounded over the last 100 or so years. The other benefit of Aldabra being so remote was that people couldn't find it. So that's why these tortoises were able to stay hidden, especially the smaller ones. They were able to hide in bushes away from people trying to take them off the island. But luckily for us, that happened. And now we are blessed with an island, an atoll, that we can use to research these ginormous beasts in ginormous numbers. So here's a little snapshot of Aldabra. We've got the main field station here with the, as you would expect, lovely Indian Ocean Sea. We've got a couple of friendly beasts coming to say hello, and the sort of bit more close up of the research station. And this bit here is the large part of Grande Terre where you see the highest density of giant tortoises in the world. Research has been carried out on the atoll since the 1960s. It was started by the Royal Society when they went out to have a look at whether Aldabra was a feasible place to land aeroplanes, to sort of have an RAF base down there. But due to the sheer number of birds flying around, they decided it wasn't the best idea. They started doing a lot of research. Then the Seychelles Island Foundation was formed to look after it, and it became a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And they've been the custodians of this atoll since the 80s. And they have been great collaborators for many researchers over the years, being able to visit Aldabra and not just focus on the tortoises, but there's lots of birds actually, and also fossils, and the marine life is pretty spectacular as well. So lots of research goes on Aldabra, and they're pretty prolific at publishing. I work for the University of Zurich, where we were able to go down and carry out some specific research on the giant tortoises. But as I say, the amount of research that has come out of Aldabra has been pretty formidable, and a lot of it was about the giant tortoise. However, there were still lots of questions that needed answering, and so with the University of Zurich and SIF, we were able to go down and look at some aspects that were highlighted in this research that was done in the 70s, to see if we could find out exactly what was going on with modern day technology. So we went down and we strapped some very chunky GPS loggers onto the backs of these giants. This one in particular is quite a small male who lives on the east side of the atoll. And these loggers had accelerometers in them. They had thermometers as well as the GPS. So we were able to investigate multiple different aspects of their movement and behavior on the atoll, which would give us a first glimpse as to where they're going and what they do. There were predictions in the 70s about what they were doing, and it turns out some of those were true. But we found some more interesting things, well, further interesting things about their lifestyle on the atoll. Firstly, we looked at their home range sizes across the atoll. So we can see that there are some fundamental differences between the sizes of the home range across the atoll, Grande Terre being the largest, but with such a large range that they're able to move in, this is not too surprising. The smaller islands with more dense vegetation, very difficult vegetation, the home ranges are quite small. And then Picard coming up, it's got lots of like open spaces as well as good feeding grounds. So the home ranges are quite a good size there. There was a little bit of difference between the males and females in their home range size, but again, this was mainly because the males on the eastern side, the Grande Terre side, move some colossal distances. But with a lot of animals that when we study movement ecology on animals, we try to put them into different categories of how they move. And the tortoises proved to be quite difficult, simply because when they live so long and their processes are so long that you're only looking at a snapshot of what they're doing. So it's quite tricky to understand what you're actually looking at. So maybe 1 year a tortoise would stay in one place and not really move very far, and then the next year it might move 5 or 6 kilometers. And we noticed this, and we wanted to investigate it further, and we're still investigating it to try and figure out what the drivers are that cause this. But to start the process, we categorized them into three categories. We had residents, which are the tortoises that mainly stay in a very small area, around 300 meters squared, for the entire time of the study, which was 4 years. Then we had this section of local migrators that were tortoises that kept moving all the time, but moving between different home ranges within their range, if you will. And then we have migrators, which is what you see where they'll stay in one area for 6 months and they'll move to another area for 6 months, and they'll repeat this year on year. We couldn't really explain it just on models, so we also mixed it up with home ranges to try and get this idea about what these tortoises are doing. But the best way to look at it is to play a video. So keep your eyes peeled. But this is some of the tortoises that are moving around on the atoll. This one here is a migrator going all the way to the inland, where it'll stay for a few months and then back down, just like this one. These are the local migrators that are constantly moving, shifting between areas. So that's the kind of movements that we would see, as opposed to a resident, which would just stay in one place for most of the time. We think the drivers for this were mainly the environment. It's very seasonal between dry and wet. So the wet season, they'll stay on the coast where there's good lush vegetation, grassland to eat. And then during the dry season, they'll head inland to some pools where they can stay cool and wait out the dry season, which can be very dry with not very much food around. So they'll drop their activity levels and just hang around before heading back out when the vegetation is lush again. And so to combine that research, we've also looked at the vegetation types that they like to use. This was with Walton in 2019. And she investigated the different types of habitat that we have on the island, on the different islands, and then looked at the differences between them and how much they use of certain vegetations. Their preferred is the grassland, if they have access to it. This is a typical habitat where you have swathes of grass with trees dotted around, like a savanna, if you will. And then you also have the standard mixed scrub, which is where you have plenty of low-lying trees where they can shade and hide from the sun. As opposed to what you'd think would just be a straightforward tortoise habitat, which is grassland. So this is quite difficult to actually study because it's very sporadic and not homogeneous across the atoll. And also it changes with the season. So if you're using a map, an aerial or a satellite image from a dry season, you're not going to see much grassland. So we have to do further investigations on this with different and multiple years, with different seasons in mind, and maybe we'll see these graphs shift a little bit. But it's still very eye-opening for us to be able to sort of try and figure out what they're doing and where they like to be. Similarly, this is also important for their kind of activity. So the day in the life of a tortoise, as you might expect, some people think they don't do very much, and well, they don't. They sleep a lot of it. You have an early morning peak where they're up very early with the sun, and they'll go and graze for a few hours before retreating into the shade, hiding away from the zenith of the sun where it gets very hot, before coming out in the afternoon for a little bit of a graze, a little bit of a feed, and then sleep it off and wake up the next morning and carry on. This was really informative. This is an average, this graph, but all the individuals had slightly different activity curves based on the kind of habitat they were living in, but also, as you'll see, depending on the season. But this is critical information for us to understand how we can manage a tortoise population knowing that they have this bimodal response to daily temperature fluctuations. Going further into temperature and the effect on this reptile, being ectotherms, they are very susceptible to temperature. So we had a look at what would be the operating temperature, the optimal operating temperature of an Aldabra giant tortoise. It turns out that the mean range where they're most active is around 28 degrees. And this is your average temperature in the Seychelles, as it happens. But they can operate quite happily within a range of 25 to 31 degrees Celsius. But there is a critical point, which is after 36 degrees Celsius, whereby it's very difficult for the tortoises to cool down. So if they start to overheat in these temperatures, it's very difficult for them to reduce that unless they're sort of plunged into a pool of cold water to be able to cool them down quick enough. Similarly, if they go into a shaded area, which also has a high temperature, ambient temperature of 31 degrees, again, they find it very, very difficult to cool down. So they have to be very aware of their environment when they're getting too hot, and to retreat into the shade as soon as possible to be able to spend the rest of the day cooling down. As they cannot sweat because they're reptiles, they will invariably just find shade or a pool and stay the rest of the time there to cool down, as it's pretty critical if they go over that. So being so in touch with their environment and being so connected to it, it's not too surprising that they are very, their behavior responds very much to rainfall. They need a lot of water to survive if they want to operate at an efficient level, but they can obviously go without water for many months on end should they need to. But in one typical year, you can see the different activity rates where it's very high during the rainy periods. And then as you go into the dry season, which are these months here, you can see the activity curve completely drops off, whereby in October, they're pretty much not doing anything during the day. And it picks up again with the wet season as it returns. So unlike other tortoises, like gopher tortoises that can bury themselves in the soil, or terrapins that can wait it out in the mud, these guys basically just, or northern tortoises that will hibernate. The Aldabra giants just basically switch off their activity for the dry season as a way of like hibernating and making sure they stay safe. Further on with the research, and a shout out to Simon, but we also do some other specific things to do with the physiology of the giant tortoises, which helps us understand their physiology better, which in turn can help us relate the wild population to, let's say, captive populations or populations that are in zoos or in breeding centers. So we've also studied the hormone levels of giant tortoises in the wild to help captive populations, particularly in zoos that want to breed them, sort of as assurance populations, to help them do that. And then we can see this is the female and male, so there's estrogen and testosterone levels over a year of the wild tortoises, and we were able to show the peak of breeding season as a very correlated between the two, and then in the dry season again that goes down. And luckily for the females, the males also stop feeling horny for parts of the year. So that was a great study to get done. Furthermore, and leading on to the genetics, because of the movement of animals that has happened over the last 100 years or so, and the bottleneck that they went through where the population went down to less than 1,000, there is not so much diversity in the population as a whole. So it's very important that we understand the genetics of these of the giant tortoises in the wild, but also these rewilded populations and some of the captive populations, to see if we can find other any diversity in the genes that we see of individuals, And that can help us to better protect these other populations from becoming too inbred. They can withstand quite a lot of inbreeding, it seems. But at the same time, we also know having a diverse population will be better. This was a study done in 2017 by a master's student at the University of Zurich, where we took lots of blood samples from giant tortoises in Aldabra, Mauritius, and Rodrigues, which is a small island of Mauritius, where there was a Silentrapsis population and where we have quite a large rewilding project there. So this is the blue is the main Aldabra clade on Aldabra. And then we have the Mauritian and Rodrigues. So they all sort of fit in there. But there was a couple of tortoises that were out there, had some alleles that didn't seem to exist in the in the other wild populations that we sampled. So that's quite interesting. And on a romantic level, it might even be that this one here in the Pomplamooses Gardens might be an ancestor of the tortoises that were originally moved in the 1870s from Seychelles to Mauritius, which would be a great thing. We'd also like to extend this out to further tortoise, Aldabra giant tortoise populations in the world, as they have been spread around the world for many, many years. And they also might hold the key to some of the diversity that has been lost due to that bottleneck. To help us do that, we are embarking on a study to try and complete the Aldabra giant tortoise genome. Up until now, the microsatellites used for the study by with our distribution of Aldabra, we used microsats from Galapagos tortoises and the Madagascan radiata tortoises. But a new study, which came out this year and is still in prep for the bigger paper, has found 149 new single nucleotide SNPs, which hopefully we'll be able to use to make the complete genome of the Aldabra giant tortoise. And that's going to have massive implications for how we can incorporate genomics into management and how we can sort of help these rewilding projects evolve. So that's really fascinating and very exciting to be able to do that. Which leads us on to why giant tortoises are being used in restoration and rewilding projects. These large-scale translocations that happened before may also need to happen again. As I mentioned earlier, the sea level rise in the Seychelles could be critical, especially for Aldabra, which already has been underwater numerous times as the climate has changed. But this time, though, if it does go underwater, or when it does go underwater, there won't be any giant tortoises to recolonize. So the thinking is, long-term thinking, is that we'll be able to translocate these animals out and set up rewilding and restoration projects using the giant Aldabra tortoise to try and protect them from the threats of living on these low-lying atolls. So we're going to focus a little bit on tortoise rewilding and captive breeding and how that can help us to protect these animals further. In the Western Indian Ocean, where we work, we've got the wild population up here, and then these are some of the rewilding sites that have happened already. So I want to focus on a few of them. One is the Seychelles project and the Mauritian project of Round Island. There are new rewilding projects being set up in Madagascar, and there's a long-term one in Rodrigues as well. So as I mentioned, the Aldabra population is about 100,000. It seems to be very stable since the 80s, 90s. It fluctuates a little bit, but on the whole, it stays around there. So that's the largest, we think, certainly the largest population of giant tortoises in the world. But the highest density of Aldabra giant tortoises belongs to the Fregate Island in the Seychelles, which is on the inner island of the Seychelles. And this is a rewilder population, which we'll go into in more detail in a bit. But they have a density there of something like 11 giant tortoises per hectare. And then we have Round Island, which is a small island of around a mile by half a mile, but very steep. And it's a fantastic restoration project, not just only from the giant tortoise perspective, but many reptile species, including the Round Island boa and the Gunter's gecko, and has seen a huge restoration project been going on over the last 50 years, and is a fascinating story. So I recommend looking that up. So these are the sites we'll focus on. But why giant tortoises? So one of the major problems with extinctions that has happened over the past 100 years or so is the loss of island megafauna, which mainly came in the guise of giant tortoises. In some places it was a giant goose or some bird species. But across the islands, especially in the Seychelles and Mauritius, we've lost the giant tortoises that are key to ecosystem function. And we like to think of them as the elephants of the islands. So why the tortoise? What makes this humble giant perfect for rewilding and island restoration projects? Firstly, they're big eaters. As herbivores, or primarily herbivores, they graze and browse, and they create swathes of open grass, but they're also able to browse and collect low-hanging fruit, which then goes through their gut passage system over about 18 days, and then deposited somewhere else. So they're excellent seed dispersers. They can consume large quantities of plant material, and in the process produce large amounts of biomass, or dung, that then can fertilize the environment. They're long distance walkers, so as I showed in the video, they can walk quite large distances. So the longest we saw in one day was about a kilometer, but over the season was about 8 kilometers. So when they're doing this, this behavior is spreading nutrients, spreading seeds through the ecosystem, damaging topsoil, moving nutrients around, and this helps the other species that are living in this habitat. Birds can feed on the insects that get disturbed, and there's further insects that can burrow, as well as some fungus and mosses that can grow in these areas. They have long lives, so an adult giant tortoise in good health and in good habitats, they can breed very well for a very long time and produce lots of offspring, which can boost the population, which is very convenient when you want to create a restoration project using these animals, as you can create solid populations very quickly that can be just left to their own devices. And with high densities of tortoises, the positive outcome of having them on your restoration project are ever increasing. We like to think of them as ecosystem engineers. So as the elephant of the reptile world, they can provide many benefits to the ecosystem and to the other species that live there. Their size and I guess their weight also allows them to modify habitats by influencing the processes of the plants and how they react to being heavily grazed, and also creating these heterogeneous landscapes that we see on Aldabra, but also that we see in some rewilded islands. And finally, probably most importantly, is seed dispersal. So they're able to consume vast quantities of fruit, as well as smaller grass seeds can stick to their feet as they walk, and their bellies and the plastron. So this enables you to use them to create the forests or the habitats that you want without having to put too much effort in yourself. Once you have the mature trees and mature grasses there, the tortoises will do the rest for you. When the seeds come through the tortoise, they're pretty much intact. They're then left in a big ball of dung, which is essentially fertilizer, and that helps them to germinate, and they can move this across your system. So what would that look like on a rewilding project? So although this is a hypothetical island, and I haven't seen one just like this, but Round Island was pretty similar. So you take a highly degraded ecosystem, which is missing key ecological functions, and this might have been caused by invasive species. So in the example of Round Island, they introduced goats and rabbits, and so they decimated the flora. And so a lot of species went extinct because of that, because they lost their habitats. But we've also seen the removal of species, so removing giant tortoises from these islands, and then human development, whereby they've just removed and destroyed the habitat. With these degraded systems, you also get low resilience. So any threats that are coming to the island might mean that it will not be able to withstand any new threats. So you take your year zero, then you can start your rewilding project. That might mean you have to reintroduce your giant tortoises to the system if they were there. So in the case of Mauritius, we had the Cylindrapsis tortoise. So we are replacing the Cylindrapsis with the Aldabra giant tortoise, which is a distant cousin, as we call it, an analog species. In other places where we don't necessarily have evidence of giant tortoises on the island, we can try to convince people that using giant tortoises is a good way of recreating that system. So that's slightly an element of controversy around rewilding, especially with using species that have not had any evidence of presence before. But in this example, we're going to reintroduce the giant tortoises to the system. We'll start planting our native flora, and we'll start with active conservation management. So the 5 years are really intensive and the most expensive part of the project to get going. By 5 to 10 years, you start to see a dynamic ecosystem returning. So the first successes of the restoration process are observed pretty soon, I think, and the island can recover a little bit, which can start pushing the island into a trajectory of speeding up into a more resilient system. We understand this through surveys and observations, good old field work, which is the bit we love. And then potentially using adaptive management, you can look at whether you need to put more tortoises in or take some out if they're being too destructive. And look at how much intervention you still need to do. Always more planting, but with planting comes other issues like weeding and manual work. But with enough tortoises, you'll be able to do that with them. And then after about 10 years, you start to see systems that you haven't seen before, seed dispersal, nutrient cycling, all starting to happen without too much intervention. And that's kind of what you want to be seeing. Once you have this stable system, you can start to put other species in that might be endangered elsewhere. For example, introducing rare bird species or some other reptile species to help you protect your island even more from any changes that will be happening and protect those species as well. So for a case study, we'll look at Fregate Island. So this is in the inner islands of the Seychelles. It's a private island with a hotel on it, so there is some development. And it also has a mix of vegetation between native and non-native, and a lot of coconuts. But it's a really interesting example of a Aldabra giant tortoise rewilding project, although initially it didn't start like that. So the owner in the 70s had a few tortoises, around 30 odd tortoises when he took over the property, and they had been introduced from Aldabra itself. So they're from the original population. In the 70s or late 70s, there was about 115 animals, so it's already increasing quite well. And 97, there was 300. So there was a sort of plateau as to, this population wasn't growing. as expected. So this then changed once they started with the rat eradication. So it's one of the larger islands where rats have been removed, and still to this day they're not there. And this really changed the breeding success of the tortoises on the island. So the rats were able to sometimes eat the eggs, but also mainly eat the juvenile tortoises. So that started to increase the population. Then in the 2000s, the owner decided to start a hand rearing project. He noticed that the tortoises still were not increasing. He wasn't finding that many juveniles around. And this probably was from people taking them off the island, as they were a very popular animal to have as a pet. And so he decided to try and start a hand rearing program whereby he encouraged people to bring baby tortoises to a nursery. This really transformed how fast the population was able to grow. And as you see, as we go further towards the 2020, the population absolutely shoots up. Now, this is probably due to monitoring. So very little population monitoring was done over the decades. But when we got there, we did a massive census, full census of the tortoise population, and it's around 2,500. So really a lot of tortoises. There were some introductions as well from other islands. Tortoises that were not kept in good conditions were brought to the island. And nowadays it's got one of the highest densities of giant tortoises on the planet. The population distribution looks pretty healthy. We've got a lot of juveniles that are bolstering the population, and a good mix of female and male tortoises. The size differences you can see here, with males being much larger than the females, but good numbers. And then the sex ratio, which is also very healthy, pretty even male-female ratio, with slightly bigger males, but the ratio is kind of the same. And then the juveniles are well spread across. It's quite hard to sex a tortoise, as I'll explain now. So between Frigate Island and Aldabra, the sex ratio is actually very similar. Here on the left, you can see the dimorphism between the Aldabra giant tortoises. This is the male on the left and the female on the right. And this explains some of the plots that we see from Aldabra. So similarly, we've got quite a good juvenile population bolstering the rest of the population. We've got a big skew on Grande Terre with more females than males. This might be because on that island all the tortoises are much smaller, so it can be quite difficult to tell the difference between a male and a female, as opposed to on these other islands where it's very clear as to what sex the tortoise is. But it goes to show that you can create a system within a very short space of time, a giant tortoise population in a short space of time, which is very similar to the wild population. So using that knowledge, we can then look at why we use them for rewilding and how quickly we can get the rewilding project going. And just to highlight that, there's a difference between mechanical restoration. So this is a project we did on Frigate Island where large swathes of bamboo and non-native species were removed by us and diggers and then planted with native trees. And while this is all very good, it takes a lot of time, a lot of effort, and is very, very expensive. If we look on the other side of the island, so this is the same island, this is where the giant tortoises mainly live. And we have the same kind of effect. Well, you can ignore the coconuts maybe, but there's a lot of them. But here you can see a tortoise turf. So this is where the tortoises have grazed over and over again, creating this herbaceous patch. And that keeps everything short. This is their dung, so they're moving the seeds around. These are the seeds that they're moving through the system, completely clean and whole and ready to germinate. And then we have, again, where they're removing non-native grass species, invasive grass species, and they're eating and eventually creating these patches of open grassland. And they even make their own shade. And here we can see a browsing line where tortoises can access shade and be able to eat the fruits of this this tree. So, and that can be done without any intervention whatsoever. So you can just leave the tortoises to their own devices and they'll do what tortoises do. So when you have a tortoise population that is free roaming, they're able to breed well. They are easily controlled. So if you've got any issues with invasive species or introducing a species that could become invasive, and you've lost control of your tortoise population, you've probably done something wrong. So you can always remove them. They are excellent at facilitating habitat restoration through the factors that I mentioned earlier, and they're incredibly efficient engineers. So with that, this is why we work with the giant tortoises, and also why we carry out so much research on the Aldabra giant tortoises, to help us create these restoration projects and rewilding projects across the Western Indian Ocean. And to do that, we set up an organization called the Indian Ocean Tortoise Alliance, otherwise known as IOTA. So I'll just do a quick cheeky plug for the organization that I work for. What we try to do is safeguard the wild populations of tortoises, especially Aldabras, but also the plowshare and the radiata. So we are looking to work on projects with those species as well. We'd like to rewild the empty islands with the giant tortoises. So a lot of islands in the Seychelles do not have giant tortoises on them. And we would like to try and fill those up with tortoises again, and promoting the Aldabra giant tortoise as a Seychelles icon for conservation, and also to give them some limelight away from their less handsome Galapagos tortoise cousins. More specifically, these are the 5 pillars that we work on. Rewilding, I've explained. When we work with non-government and governmental partners to try and establish projects in Seychelles, Mauritius, Reunion, and Madagascar. This might be more things, things like translocations, moving tortoises away from their native range to replace extinct giant tortoises, extinct Cylindropsis, to increase the research network. So I've explained some of the research that's been going on with all the many different people that have been doing it over the past decade or so, but we still need to understand more about tortoise biology, their reproduction, their movement, how they thermoregulate, also more interactions between plants and tortoises, and definitely the genomic level, which would have a massive impact for the projects, but also being able to establish better breeding systems for them. Ecosystem restoration, this is the more practical side of things, so partnering with organizations to actually restore the habitats and work with people and different organizations to make that happen, of course, including the Aldabra giant tortoises. Outreach, so we've already started campaigns to create awareness and improve the welfare of Aldabra giant tortoises in the Western Indian Ocean. And of course, fundraise and try and create money so we can support projects in the wider region. And then ecotourism in the Seychelles, this is a big one, as lots of people enjoy getting selfies with giant tortoises, but they're not necessarily kept in best conditions. But also there's a way of showing people how conservation works on the ground using these animals as a champion for restoration and conservation. So with that, I'd just like to thank you for listening. And if you have any questions, please get in touch. Here's some information about where you can find us. Thank you.